such as statues of former slave owners or, for example, the statue of Christopher Columbus, should be removed and placed in a museum with context. And my guest this morning is Dr. Ian Bethel Bennett, live from Bahamas, where he's an associate professor at the University of Bahamas, I believe. Good morning, Dr. Bethel Bennett.
Good morning.
Dr. Bennett, I don't know if you heard my introduction with regard to the call by people, not just right here in Trinidad and Tobago with regard to our statues here, but around the world, statues that depict slavery and some of the negative periods in the history of Black people around the world, that they be removed and placed into a museum where there's specific context. What are your views on this?
Okay, you broke up there, but yeah, I think that's a necessary move because we have these statues that stand completely decontextualized and erase everybody else's history, because the history of the enslaved or former enslaved people is actually never told, except in somewhere like Jamaica, where they actually have a celebration of Black and emancipated bodies in their history and in Kingston. So Christopher Columbus, for example, I mean, people say, oh, well, it's a tourist attraction, but tourists can go to the museum to see Christopher Columbus. He doesn't need to impose himself on a 21st century Caribbean, just like Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth. Why do they have to be, Queen Elizabeth the first, not the second. Why do they have to be more prominent than our local leaders? So we just seem to disregard Black leadership and Black bodies in favor of white statues. And that romanticization and nostalgia about empire, colonialism, and slavery is really problematic.
But why are statues relevant in the first place? And what role do statues play in the 21st century?
I actually can't hear you, sorry.
I was asking you, why are statues relevant in the first place, and what role do statues really play in the 21st century?
Statues play an important role in the 21st century, but it doesn't mean that we have to focus everything on them, because one of the problems is that the stories that are not present are almost more important than the stories that the statues tell. And the statues, for the most part, actually don't tell any stories because they just stand there without any kind of historical placards or historical information being added to them. So we have, for example, in the Bahamas, we have Queen Victoria in Parliament Square. Why is she there? Why does she continue to dominate that space? And on the other side of the road, we have the former prime minister, but who's much smaller than she is. So what are we saying? What respect are we giving to a colonial power that continues to colonize, not just economically, but psychologically, mentally, emotionally? So the landscape in a lot of ways has to change because the landscape is dominated by a former power. The discussion or the debate now with the Belgian Congo, or the former now Republic of Congo, is really telling about how far we've come in what we are willing to do to kind of burst open the impacts of slavery and colonialism in the 21st century. Because I'm not sure if you've seen it, but they're actually starting to discuss maybe making an apology for all the atrocities that King Leopold did in the Congo. Mm-hmm. So statues really impact the way people view themselves. And the more you see statues of yourselves, the more you understand who you are, the better your relationship with self and space is. So I hope that answers your question.
Dr. Bethel Bennett, good morning. Aside from the statues being in a place of prominence, and as Lisa mentioned earlier, the history behind them being skewed, added to that, what we had been taught in history class in school, for instance, in primary school, secondary school, is that of a skewed history as well. How do you reconcile with generations being taught this skewed history, even from the school level, and what the truth behind it is that we need to address now?
That's a good question. And one of the challenges we have is that actually talking about slavery. So you have this idea that Britain dominated the Caribbean, well, the Anglophone Caribbean as it did. But the part that's missing totally usually is the fact that slavery was a really brutal period. And even after emancipation happened, the former enslaved Africans were not freed per se because they still had to work for their former masters. And so these relations of power continue into the present day. So the story, the narrative has to change, and there has to be some inclusion of Caribbean voices, because those have been excluded by, I don't want to, an institutionalized whiteness that is, as British historians talk about, makes others subject to them. So there's a whiteness that is theorized and presented as being much more intelligent, much purer, much more civilized than the blackness that actually inhabits the space, and that blackness for all purposes should be erased. So there were lots of ads in the 19th century and early 20th century that showed black bodies being whitened through washing them, because that was a way to getting purer. So the discussion has to change, but the discussion has to change in the Caribbean, because it has to be driven by Caribbean historians, and that does happen in some spaces, telling what slavery was really about and how we still see slavery in effect today. So that is key. The debates have to really be actively engaged with. I know Sir Hilary Beckles and a lot of other historians are doing this work, but the silences around what happens on Barbuda, why it happens, how it happens, and why it's facilitated are almost as important as saying, well, development and tourism are important. Or actually they eclipse the narrative because we must be nice for the tourists. And I know Trinidad doesn't have as much tourism as some of the other islands, but Tobago does. And tourism really sets the tone for a lot of the discussion and whose lives matter.
Dr. Bennett, do you think that there's a way in the short term that we can find to navigate a way forward? Because it seems like it's such a daunting task. Like all of these conversations, I mean, they've been happening, people have been doing the work, but yet still we see the effects of, racism and of colonialism still happening. Like you just said with tourism, like it's such a big factor for a lot of the islands here in the Caribbean. Do you see a short-term solution or a temporary way forward? I don't know. It just feels so daunting.
The only way through it is, the only way through it. So we got to move through it in order to come around it, I guess. The discussion is never going to be easy because we've been programmed to think that tourism is more important than our own lives, and without tourism that we will fail. If we actually start looking at building better industries locally that connect with international industries, then things will be different. But the key there is actually changing the paradigm of who owns what, because a lot of the local industries are owned by a small elite that was established during slavery. So I hear you, but if we don't have those conversations, nothing will ever change. I don't think there is a temporary fix.
Do you
We've
think that
got to really challenge the way some leaders continue to, I'm not sure the best word, continue to celebrate the fact that we were exploited by Britain? Because this is, this shows how civilized we are.
Yeah.
Even though we have been tortured for more than, I don't know how many 100 years.
Yeah, Dr. Bennett, this is not a conversation that we can have in one day, because we have to talk about, how do we contextualize what's taking place around the world with regard to Black Lives Matter movement, as well as we want to talk about will we ever see in continuing what Raucus just asked about, seeing the end of racism, classism, and colorism. So we're going to call you back before the end of the week to have the part 2 of this conversation. But I want to thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Ian Bethel Bennett. You are with the University of Bahamas, correct?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, author and associate professor at the University of Bahamas. Thank you very much there. It's been a wonderful morning, guys, but we have to kick it upstairs. Remember to make a difference today. Now, Raucus, Carrie, and Lisa. We'll see you tomorrow, guys. Be safe on the roads. Bye.